You are born into a world defined by lineage, politics, and the weight of history before you even take your first breath. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, entered the world in 69 BCE, in a period when the Mediterranean world was in a state of constant negotiation between power, survival, and ambition. To understand Cleopatra's significance, you must first understand her heritage, a lineage that was, in some ways, more complex than the throne she would one day claim. The Ptolemaic dynasty itself was a product of conquest and adaptation. After Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, his vast empire was divided among his generals. The Diadochi, Ptolemy I Soter, a former general of Alexander, seized control of Egypt in 305 BCE and established a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as a Hellenistic monarchy, meaning that while they were Greek in origin, they had to adapt to the complex social, religious, and administrative systems of their new home. This created a unique environment in which Greek and Egyptian traditions coexisted, sometimes uneasily, and where political marriages were often used to maintain control. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was one of the last rulers in a long line of complex familial successions. He inherited a throne that was both powerful and precarious, as Egypt was surrounded by ambitious neighbors and under the ever-watchful eye of Rome. Auletes, himself, was a figure of contradictions. He sought to emulate the Hellenistic kings before him, indulging in traditional displays of Greek culture, but he also had to navigate the demands of an Egyptian populace that respected the pharaoh as both a political leader and a divine figure. This meant that even as a child, Cleopatra was growing up in a household where political calculation and cultural negotiation were everyday realities. You imagine young Cleopatra in this world, a palace filled with the scent of incense, the low murmur of attendants, and the occasional echo of foreign diplomats arriving to negotiate trade or treaties. She would have been taught Greek language, literature, and philosophy, along with the practical knowledge necessary for leadership, diplomacy, mathematics, and the workings of the complex Egyptian bureaucracy. Yet, she would also have been aware of the Egyptian rituals, the reverence for the gods, and the traditions that linked the pharaohs to the Nile itself. From the very beginning, her education was designed not merely for survival, but for power. One of the most significant aspects of Cleopatra's early life was her family environment. The Ptolemies were notorious for intermarriage, often siblings marrying each other to preserve the royal bloodline and solidify claims to the throne. Cleopatra's mother is not definitively known, though some historians suggest it may have been Cleopatra V Tryphena, possibly a cousin or sister of Ptolemy XII. These familial arrangements meant that Cleopatra's early years were defined by a network of complex family dynamics, alliances, rivalries, and suspicions that would later influence her reign. You can almost feel the tension in these relationships, the constant undercurrent of potential betrayal and ambition, which shaped not only political decisions, but personal interactions within the royal household. The political landscape of Egypt during Cleopatra's childhood was volatile. Rome was becoming an increasingly dominant force in the Mediterranean, and the Ptolemies had learned to negotiate, bribe, and sometimes submit to Roman interests to maintain their independence. Ptolemy XII himself had faced exile and political challenges, relying on Roman support to regain his throne. Cleopatra's childhood, therefore, was marked not only by the luxurious trappings of royalty, but also by the ever-present reality that power could be fleeting, and survival required intelligence, adaptability, and cunning. You might wonder how a child absorbs such complexity. Cleopatra's early exposure to politics, coupled with her intelligence, meant that she developed a keen understanding of human behavior and power structures from a young age. Unlike children in ordinary households, whose play might be carefree, Cleopatra's games could have involved strategic thinking, role-playing, diplomatic negotiations, or observing her father's interactions with ministers and foreign envoys. These early experiences, though seemingly mundane, were crucial in shaping the analytical mind that would later allow her to navigate treacherous political waters. It is also worth noting the broader cultural environment. Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, was a city unlike any other. It was a melting pot of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other cultures, where trade, philosophy, and science flourished. The Library of Alexandria, though perhaps not yet at its legendary peak during Cleopatra's youth, symbolized a hub of knowledge and intellectual ambition. You can picture Cleopatra wandering through the palace gardens or along the bustling streets of Alexandria, surrounded by scholars, merchants, and artisans, absorbing the vibrancy of a city that was both cosmopolitan and deeply connected to the traditions of its Egyptian past. Amidst this environment, Cleopatra's identity began to take shape. She was not just a Greek princess in an Egyptian setting. She was a potential pharaoh, a future ruler whose legitimacy depended on her understanding of both Greek and Egyptian customs. This duality would define much of her reign. To the Greek elite, she was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, steeped in Hellenistic culture and politics. To the Egyptian people, she had to embody the traditional role of the pharaoh, participating in rituals, understanding religious symbolism, and maintaining the prosperity of the land. The question of language is also crucial. Unlike many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, Cleopatra is believed to have spoken Egyptian fluently, along with several other languages. This ability to communicate across cultures was more than a practical skill. It was a subtle, political tool. Being able to address the Egyptian populace in their own tongue, understand their customs, and navigate their expectations gave her an advantage over rulers who relied solely on Greek advisors. You can almost hear her voice, young and attentive, practicing the words that would later command loyalty and respect from a diverse kingdom. Childhood for Cleopatra was, therefore, a balancing act between education, observation, and the careful cultivation of identity. Every lesson in literature, every discussion of trade or politics, and every observation of her father's court contributed to the formation of a ruler who would need to be both shrewd and adaptable. You can imagine her sitting quietly in the palace, not merely playing, but thinking, absorbing, and questioning a habit that would serve her well in the years to come. Yet, even in such a structured environment, uncertainty loomed. The Ptolemaic dynasty was fraught with internal strife, and the political landscape of the Mediterranean was unpredictable. Cleopatra's early years were marked by the tension between expectation and reality. She was born into royalty, yet survival and power were never guaranteed. This awareness of vulnerability, combined with the responsibilities of potential rule, created a foundation of vigilance and calculation that would characterize her approach to leadership. By the time Cleopatra approached adolescence, she was already recognized as intellectually gifted and politically aware. The historical record suggests that she was not content to be a passive figurehead. She learned about governance, military matters, and the intricacies of diplomacy. In a world where the death of a king or the betrayal of an ally could upend an entire dynasty, her early education was not merely academic. It was a preparation for survival in the highest echelons of power. And yet, despite this preparation, one cannot help but wonder, did young Cleopatra fully understand the weight of her inheritance? Did she anticipate the challenges, the betrayals, and the political entanglements that awaited her? Or did she, like any child, retain moments of innocence, fleeting days when the palace was a playground rather than a court of intrigue? This tension between the ordinary life of a child and the extraordinary destiny that awaited her is perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of her early years. Cleopatra was born into a world defined by expectations, tradition, and political necessity. Yet she also possessed the potential to reshape that world through her intellect, charm, and strategic insight. The seeds of her legacy were planted in these early years, nurtured by education, observation, and the subtle lessons of power whispered in the corridors of the palace. As you consider these beginnings, you might ask yourself, how does a child, even one of royal blood, internalize the complexities of a kingdom and a dynasty teetering on the edge of survival? How much of Cleopatra's later skill in diplomacy, culture, and politics was inherited, and how much was learned in those quiet, formative years? In the next section, we will explore the challenges Cleopatra faced as she moved from childhood into adolescence, the political intrigues that threatened her family's throne, and the early decisions that hinted at the extraordinary ruler she would become. As Cleopatra moved from the innocent curiosity of childhood into the more complicated awareness of adolescence, the world around her became increasingly unpredictable. In the Ptolemaic court, survival depended not on innocence, but on vigilance, cunning, and the ability to navigate an ever-shifting web of alliances and betrayals. By the time she was a teenager, Cleopatra's education and upbringing had already instilled in her the essential skills of observation, patience, and strategy skills that would later define her reign. The political climate of Egypt during Cleopatra's adolescence was precarious. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was under constant pressure, both from within his dynasty and from external forces, particularly Rome. The Roman Republic, although far from the empire it would later become, had already begun to assert dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. Roman senators and generals frequently intervened in the affairs of client kingdoms, offering protection in exchange for loyalty or taking advantage of weakness for territorial gain. Ptolemy XII understood that his survival depended on a delicate balancing act, maintaining the appearance of independence while appeasing Rome with tributes, gifts, and diplomatic favors. Cleopatra's adolescence coincided with one of the most politically tumultuous periods of her father's reign. Around 58 BCE, a rebellion erupted in Upper Egypt, a region historically difficult for the Ptolemies to control. The revolt was fueled by local dissatisfaction with taxation, administrative corruption, and the perception of foreign rulers who had little understanding of Egyptian culture. For young Cleopatra, the rebellion would have been both a warning and a lesson. Ruling a kingdom required more than lineage. It demanded attentiveness to the grievances of the people, foresight in administration, and the capacity to respond decisively to crises. It is likely that Cleopatra, observing her father's response to these challenges, began to understand the nuances of governance. Ptolemy XII's strategies were not always successful. Some failed to quell unrest, while others relied on bribes or appeasement. Cleopatra, who would later become known for her extraordinary political acumen, saw firsthand the consequences of misjudgment. She learned that a ruler could not depend solely on inherited authority. Legitimacy required a combination of personal skill, public perception, and careful diplomacy. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. The Ptolemaic dynasty was notorious for its internal rivalries, a characteristic that often erupted into open conflict. Cleopatra's siblings, particularly her older sister Berenice IV and younger brother Ptolemy XIII, would eventually play central roles in these struggles. But even during her adolescence, tensions were palpable. Familial bonds were entwined with ambition, and every conversation, every glance in the court could carry political significance. Cleopatra's ability to read people, understand intentions, and anticipate moves was honed in these early encounters. Education continued to play a central role in shaping Cleopatra's mind. Beyond Greek language and literature, she studied history, rhetoric, and philosophy disciplines that would later serve her in negotiations with foreign leaders. Mathematics, astronomy, and the sciences were also part of her curriculum, reflecting the Hellenistic tradition of broad learning. But perhaps most crucial was her exposure to Egyptian culture. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra is said to have mastered the Egyptian language and understood the religious and cultural rituals that legitimized her as pharaoh. By her teenage years, she was uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between Greek and Egyptian traditions, a skill that would become one of her greatest political assets. You might imagine her moving through the grand halls of the royal palace, observing not only her father, but the ministers, priests, and generals who managed the kingdom. Every meeting, every debate, every ceremonial ritual offered a lesson. She learned to interpret the subtle cues of power. A hesitant gesture from a minister, a tense exchange between generals, the approval or disapproval of priests who represented the spiritual backbone of the nation. Cleopatra's mind, already sharp, absorbed these lessons, preparing her for a future where knowledge and perception would be as crucial as authority. Yet adolescence brought not only education, but personal trials. In the mid-52nd BCE, Ptolemy XII was forced to flee Egypt due to mounting political pressure and the threat of rebellion. The king sought refuge in Rome, leaving the kingdom in the hands of his older daughter, Berenice IV. This period of exile was a critical moment for Cleopatra, who, though still young, witnessed the fragility of power. The absence of her father destabilized the dynasty, and the prospect that her family could lose control of Egypt demonstrated the stakes of leadership. The young princess learned that even royal blood could not guarantee security. Skill, alliances, and timing were essential. Cleopatra's adolescence also coincided with the increasing presence of Rome in Egyptian affairs. Roman influence was not merely political, but economic. Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain, was vital to the stability of Rome, which made the kingdom both an opportunity and a vulnerability. Cleopatra observed the interactions between Roman envoys and Egyptian officials, noting the subtleties of negotiation, persuasion, and leverage. These encounters were lessons in the complexities of international politics, emphasizing that survival often required understanding both the desires of powerful outsiders and the needs of one's own people. During these years, Cleopatra likely began to cultivate her own identity and strategies. Unlike some of her Ptolemaic predecessors, who relied entirely on Greek advisors, she would later demonstrate a remarkable ability to manage her own court, communicate with foreign leaders, and present herself as a ruler in her own right. These tendencies were visible even in her adolescence. A preference for careful observation, a deliberate approach to decision-making, and an emerging understanding of how personal charisma could complement political skill. You might also consider the personal qualities that were being shaped during this period. Cleopatra was reputedly intelligent, ambitious, and highly perceptive. Her ability to learn languages, engage with scholars, and understand complex political dynamics was not merely the result of formal education, but also a reflection of innate curiosity and determination. Adolescence, in her case, was a period of preparation, intellectual, emotional, and political, for the immense responsibilities she would soon inherit. And yet, even as Cleopatra matured, uncertainties remained. The kingdom was unstable, her father's reign was under threat, and familial rivalries were ever present. Would she be able to navigate these challenges when the time came? Could a young woman, still in the shadow of her father's authority, assert herself in a male-dominated political environment? These questions lingered, shaping both her ambitions and the perception of those around her. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, she was no longer merely a princess observing her father's rule. She was a political actor in her own right, aware of the fragility of power and the intricacies of diplomacy. The lessons of her adolescence, patience, observation, negotiation, and cultural fluency formed the foundation for the ruler she would become. Every rebellion, every interaction with ministers or foreign envoys, every insight into the vulnerabilities of her family strengthened her understanding of leadership. And yet, there remained one final question, lingering like a shadow over her adolescence. When the time came for her to ascend the throne, would Cleopatra be able to assert her authority over a kingdom steeped in tradition, threatened by external powers, and divided by internal rivalries? The seeds of her ambition were planted, but the fruits of power had yet to be claimed. In the next section, we will follow Cleopatra as she takes the throne of Egypt, navigates her first political challenges, and begins the path that will intertwine her destiny with some of the most powerful men of Rome, shaping the history of the Mediterranean world for generations. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, the foundations of her reign were already forming in ways both subtle and profound. The years of observation, careful study, and personal growth within the palace walls had prepared her not merely to inherit a throne, but to confront the complexity of ruling a kingdom whose influence stretched far beyond its borders. When Cleopatra ascended the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, in 51 BCE, she stepped into a world where authority was fragile, politics were treacherous, and the very concept of legitimacy was constantly contested. The dual kingship she inherited was itself a product of tradition. The Ptolemies, in keeping with dynastic custom, often ruled jointly, typically pairing siblings in marriages or co-regencies to consolidate power. Cleopatra's initial arrangement with Ptolemy XIII, who was likely only a teenager at the time, reflected both this tradition and the practical reality that she required a nominal co-ruler to satisfy court protocols. Yet, from the beginning, it was clear that Cleopatra's intellect, education, and strategic vision set her apart. While her brother had the formal title of pharaoh, Cleopatra possessed the skill to influence policy, navigate court politics, and interact with Egypt's diverse populations in ways that her peers could not. Her first years on the throne were not marked by grand declarations or dramatic upheavals, but rather by the careful exercise of power through administration, diplomacy, and cultural engagement. Cleopatra understood that the appearance of stability was as important as actual authority. She participated in the formal ceremonies that legitimized the pharaoh in the eyes of the Egyptian populace, presenting herself as both a divine ruler and a capable administrator. These rituals were not mere theatrics. They were essential to maintaining social cohesion in a kingdom where tradition and religion were intertwined with political power. Yet beneath this surface of stability, tensions simmered. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, viewed Cleopatra's intelligence and influence as a threat. These court figures were accustomed to managing rulers who were less assertive, more malleable, and willing to follow the guidance of their ministers. Cleopatra's confidence and ability to act independently disrupted the established balance, creating friction that would soon escalate into open conflict. During this period, Cleopatra also faced economic and diplomatic challenges. Egypt's wealth, largely derived from its agricultural surplus, particularly grain, was vital not only for domestic prosperity, but for its influence in the wider Mediterranean world. Cleopatra understood that managing resources efficiently, maintaining public order, and securing favorable trade agreements were essential to her legitimacy. Her awareness of Rome's growing power meant that diplomacy had to be approached with care. Appeasement could secure temporary stability, while missteps might provoke military or political retaliation. Cleopatra's first major test came in the form of internal political maneuvering. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, seeking to consolidate power for themselves, began plotting to marginalize Cleopatra and diminish her influence. The young queen recognized the danger, understanding that survival in this environment required both courage and strategic acumen. She began cultivating her own network of loyalists, officials, administrators, and influential Egyptians who appreciated her intelligence and vision. This network would become a crucial tool in her efforts to maintain authority, providing not only political support, but practical assistance in navigating the treacherous waters of court intrigue. One of Cleopatra's most significant strategies during this period was her skillful use of image and perception. She was acutely aware that rulership was as much about appearances as about policy. By presenting herself as both approachable to the Egyptian populace and sophisticated to the Greek elite, she reinforced her legitimacy. Coins minted in her name, statues depicting her in the guise of traditional deities, and public appearances in ceremonial dress were all carefully designed to communicate stability, divine favor, and authority. In these acts, the young queen demonstrated an understanding of the subtle interplay between symbolism, psychology, and power, an understanding that would serve her throughout her reign. The relationship with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, remained complicated. While custom dictated a shared rule, in practice, the balance of power was unstable. Cleopatra's growing influence made her a target for rivals who sought to control the pharaoh for their own advantage. By the mid-52nd BCE, tensions within the court escalated to a point where political confrontation became inevitable. Cleopatra, however, approached these challenges not with brute force, but with calculated strategy. Her knowledge of court dynamics, her understanding of Egyptian traditions, and her emerging diplomatic skills allowed her to maneuver effectively, even in the face of potential threats. External pressures soon compounded these internal challenges. Rome, whose influence over Egypt had been steadily increasing for decades, was a critical factor in the kingdom's political calculus. Cleopatra recognized that the support of Roman leaders could either secure her position or undermine it. She began to prepare herself for engagement with the Mediterranean's dominant power, studying not only Roman politics, but also the personalities of key figures who might affect her reign. This foresight was a hallmark of her approach. Cleopatra understood that the fate of her kingdom was inseparable from the shifting alliances and ambitions of faraway capitals. Even in these early years of rule, Cleopatra demonstrated a remarkable combination of intelligence, adaptability, and resilience. She navigated crises with a measured approach, balancing tradition and innovation, diplomacy and authority. These formative experiences on the throne were more than trials. They were the crucible in which her leadership was forged. By learning to manage the expectations of her subjects, the ambitions of her family, and the influence of foreign powers, Cleopatra laid the groundwork for the extraordinary influence she would wield over the course of her life. Yet, despite her skill, the future remained uncertain. The Ptolemaic dynasty was fraught with instability, and Cleopatra's position was constantly challenged by internal rivals and the external pressures of Rome. The path ahead required not only intelligence and strategy, but courage, decisiveness, and an understanding of human behavior that extended beyond her immediate environment. She had inherited more than a throne. She had inherited a complex web of obligations, rivalries, and threats that would test every facet of her abilities. As you reflect on Cleopatra's early reign, you might ask, how does a young ruler maintain authority in a kingdom defined by tradition, expectation, and external influence? How much of Cleopatra's later success stemmed from her education and upbringing, and how much from her innate qualities, her intelligence, her adaptability, and her capacity to read the intentions of others? These questions hint at the delicate balance that would define Cleopatra's life. The interplay between preparation and opportunity, education and instinct, observation and action. The seeds planted in her childhood and adolescence, the lessons of survival, strategy, and perception, were now beginning to bear fruit. Cleopatra was no longer merely a princess, learning from her father. She was a queen, stepping cautiously but confidently into a world that demanded her full attention, her full intellect, and her full ambition. In the next story, we will explore the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt, before Cleopatra, tracing the long history of her family, the structures and traditions she inherited, and the political and cultural forces that shaped the kingdom she now ruled. These stories will provide the context to understand not only Cleopatra herself, but the world she sought to navigate with extraordinary skill and insight. To understand Cleopatra's rule, you must first understand the kingdom she inherited, a land of ancient traditions, immense wealth, and a dynasty that was foreign in origin, yet intricately woven into Egyptian culture. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries before Cleopatra ascended the throne, was a complex blend of Greek and Egyptian political structures, religious practices, and cultural expectations. Its origins trace back to the aftermath of one of the most dramatic events in world history, the death of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his empire stretched from Greece to India, held together not by permanent institutions, but by his personal authority. The vacuum left by his passing triggered a series of conflicts among his generals, known as the Diadochi, who vied for control over different parts of the empire. Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted companions, seized Egypt in 305 BCE and declared himself pharaoh. In doing so, he established a dynasty that would last until the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE. The Ptolemies faced immediate challenges. Egypt was a land of great wealth, centered on the Nile, but it was also steeped in millennia of political, religious, and social traditions. A foreign dynasty could not simply rule through conquest alone. It had to integrate into a culture where the pharaoh was not just a king, but a divine figure, a living intermediary between the gods and the people. Ptolemy I and his successors embraced this dual identity, presenting themselves in the trappings of Greek kingship, while adopting the rituals and iconography of Egyptian religion. They learned to perform the ceremonies, maintain the temples, and respect the traditions that legitimize their rule. The dynasty was also characterized by a peculiar blend of Hellenistic and Egyptian administrative practices. The Greek influence manifested in the establishment of cities such as Alexandria, the promotion of Greek language and culture, and the development of institutions like the Library of Alexandria and the Museum. These initiatives reflected the Ptolemies' desire to link themselves to the intellectual and cultural prestige of the Greek world, projecting an image of sophistication and cosmopolitan power. At the same time, they relied on the traditional structures of Egyptian governance, a bureaucracy that collected taxes, monitored agricultural production, and maintained law and order along the Nile. This dual system required constant negotiation and oversight, as the Ptolemies had to maintain the loyalty of Greek elites while appeasing the local Egyptian population. The practice of dynastic intermarriage became a defining feature of Ptolemaic rule. In an effort to preserve the purity of the royal line and avoid external claims to the throne, Ptolemy I and his descendants frequently married siblings or close relatives. While this strategy strengthened dynastic continuity, it also created internal tensions. Rivalries, jealousies, and power struggles were inevitable, and these family dynamics often erupted into outright conflict. Cleopatra's own life would be shaped by these patterns. Co-regencies with brothers, conflicts over succession, and the constant necessity of consolidating personal authority within a dynasty prone to internal strife. Economically, the Ptolemaic kingdom was extraordinarily prosperous, but wealth brought its own challenges. The Nile's fertility ensured abundant grain production, which became a critical export to the Mediterranean world, particularly Rome. Trade in papyrus, gold, and other commodities further enhanced the kingdom's wealth. Yet this prosperity required meticulous management. Irrigation systems needed constant maintenance, harvests had to be monitored, and taxation systems had to balance the needs of the state with the ability of the populace to pay. Failure in administration could spark unrest, rebellion, or famine. For the Ptolemies, the daily work of governance, the seemingly mundane tasks of overseeing scribes, collecting taxes, and maintaining infrastructure, was essential to sustaining power. The dynasty also faced constant threats from external powers. Carthage, the Seleucid Empire, and eventually Rome all represented potential sources of military pressure. Egypt's wealth made it a target, and the Ptolemies were acutely aware that their survival depended on both diplomacy and strategic alliances. They sent envoys, negotiated treaties, and, when necessary, prepared for military engagement. Cleopatra would inherit not only this wealth, but also the delicate responsibility of navigating international politics in a world where power was as likely to shift through negotiation as it was through force. Culturally, the Ptolemies were patrons of learning and the arts, leaving a legacy that shaped Alexandria into a hub of knowledge. The library and the museum attracted scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers, creating an environment that celebrated intellectual achievement. While this environment fostered innovation and prestige, it also reinforced social stratification. Greek elites dominated administration and scholarship, while Egyptians maintained traditional religious and cultural roles. Cleopatra would later demonstrate remarkable skill in bridging these worlds, a capacity that had roots in the centuries of Hellenistic influence preceding her reign. The dynasty's religious policies were equally significant. Ptolemaic rulers embraced the Egyptian gods, but often syncretized them with Greek counterparts to enhance legitimacy among both populations. Pharaohs were depicted in temple reliefs, participated in rituals, and were considered divine intermediaries. Cleopatra's early exposure to these traditions, even before her ascension, prepared her for the role she would play as both monarch and religious figure, reinforcing her authority in ways that went beyond politics alone. Despite these efforts at consolidation, the Ptolemaic period was marked by instability. Succession disputes were frequent, with brothers, sisters, and other relatives competing for the throne. Foreign influence, particularly from Rome, was a persistent concern. as the kingdom's wealth and strategic position made it a valuable ally or a tempting conquest. Factions within the court, including powerful ministers, military leaders, and priestly authorities, constantly vied for influence. Cleopatra would inherit a kingdom that was politically fragile, economically vital, culturally complex, and internationally significant. A kingdom in which even small errors could have enormous consequences. Even the boring details of governance record-keeping, taxation, temple maintenance, and ceremonial observance played a role in maintaining stability. Every grain shipment along the Nile, every payment to priests, every festival honoring the gods was both a practical necessity and a symbol of continuity. The Ptolemies' attention to these matters, though mundane to modern eyes, ensured the survival of the dynasty across centuries. Cleopatra's later effectiveness as a ruler would build upon these carefully maintained systems, demonstrating that the foundations of great leadership often lie in routine, diligence, and consistency. In these early centuries of the Ptolemaic dynasty, patterns emerged that would shape Cleopatra's reign. The blending of Greek and Egyptian culture, the use of religion to legitimize authority, the reliance on diplomacy and strategic alliances, the importance of administration and record-keeping. All these elements formed the backdrop against which she would rise. By understanding the dynasty before her, you can better appreciate the context in which she operated, a world of inherited structures, established traditions, and fragile political equilibrium. And yet, despite centuries of experience, the Ptolemaic dynasty remained vulnerable. The combination of internal rivalries, external pressures, and the challenges of ruling a culturally diverse kingdom meant that every new ruler faced uncertainty. When Cleopatra eventually ascended the throne, she would confront these same challenges, but with the advantage of youth, intelligence, and a remarkable capacity for adaptation. One cannot help but wonder, how did centuries of dynastic precedent shape the choices Cleopatra would later make? Did she see her predecessors' successes and failures as a guide, a warning, or both? How much of her strategic brilliance was the result of personal talent, and how much was informed by the careful observation of generations of rulers who came before her? In the next section, we will explore the reigns of her immediate ancestors, examining the political intrigues, economic policies, and family dynamics that Cleopatra inherited. A closer look at the kingdom that prepared her for the extraordinary challenges of her own rule. As we move closer to Cleopatra's own time, the Ptolemaic dynasty begins to reveal a pattern of recurring challenges, ambitions, and miscalculations that would shape the world she inherited. While the early Ptolemies, Ptolemy I through Ivy, focused on consolidating power, establishing administration, and blending Greek and Egyptian traditions, the later rulers faced a more treacherous landscape. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt's prosperity made it a prize for Rome, and the dynasty's internal divisions were increasingly exploited by external powers. Cleopatra's immediate ancestors, particularly her grandfather Ptolemy IX Lathyrus and father Ptolemy XII Auletes, provide a vivid picture of the complexities she inherited. Ptolemy IX's reign was marked by constant tension with his siblings, including his mother Cleopatra III and brother Ptolemy IX. Rivalries often escalated into outright civil war. These conflicts were not just personal disputes, they reflected the fragile nature of co-regency traditions, the precariousness of dynastic succession, and the ever-present influence of court advisors who could manipulate events to their advantage. Cleopatra, observing these patterns from a young age, would have learned that family loyalty was fragile and that power depended as much on strategy and alliances as on bloodline. Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father, inherited a kingdom that was simultaneously wealthy, strategically vital, and politically unstable. His reign illustrates both the possibilities and dangers inherent in ruling Egypt at the time. Economically, he benefited from Egypt's vast grain surplus and the taxes collected from trade along the Mediterranean. Yet these resources also attracted the attention of Rome, which increasingly demanded tribute, loyalty, and political alignment. Ptolemy XII's attempts to maintain independence were fraught with difficulty. Miscalculations could easily provoke rebellion within Egypt, or trigger Roman intervention. The king's eventual exile to Rome in 58 BCE exemplifies the delicate balance a Ptolemaic ruler had to maintain between appeasing powerful neighbors and sustaining domestic legitimacy. Cleopatra's early exposure to these events likely had a profound impact on her understanding of power. Watching her father navigate exile, diplomacy, and the eventual restoration of his throne would have offered lessons in resilience, negotiation, and the necessity of strategic alliances. She could see, in practical terms, how a ruler's position was contingent on both internal loyalty and external support. These lessons were reinforced by her own observations of the court. Ministers scheming for influence, generals wielding practical power, and priests safeguarding religious authority. Each of these groups represented both an opportunity and a potential threat to the stability of the throne. The Ptolemaic dynasty's reliance on co-regency and intermarriage often created further instability. These arrangements, intended to secure the continuity of the dynasty, sometimes intensified rivalries. Cleopatra's family history was rife with examples of brothers and sisters turning against one another, often with devastating consequences. These internal struggles demonstrated the inherent tension between personal ambition and dynastic responsibility. Cleopatra would later face her own set of co-regents and siblings, but her education and early exposure to these dynamics gave her a unique advantage. She understood not only the importance of familial alliances, but also the risks of over-reliance on blood ties alone. Roman influence, meanwhile, was an increasingly decisive factor in Egyptian politics. By the time Ptolemy XII ruled, Rome had extended its influence across the eastern Mediterranean, and its leaders were acutely aware of Egypt's wealth and strategic importance. Roman diplomats, generals, and political factions frequently intervened in Ptolemaic affairs. The kingdom's survival depended on astute diplomacy, payment of tributes, and strategic marriages. Cleopatra's father understood these realities and sought support from Rome when necessary, particularly during periods of internal unrest. These experiences provided young Cleopatra with a template for interacting with the Mediterranean's dominant power. Understanding the personalities, ambitions, and expectations of foreign leaders would be as critical as managing affairs at home. Yet the dynasty's internal weaknesses persisted. Ptolemy XII's court was rife with intrigue, corruption, and factionalism. Advisors such as the eunuch Pothinus and generals like Achillas wielded enormous influence, often acting as kingmakers or power brokers. Cleopatra, observing these dynamics, would have learned the importance of cultivating loyalty, understanding motives, and navigating the intricate web of influence that characterized the Ptolemaic court. The ordinary details of governance, tax collection, temple oversight, military administration were inseparable from political survival. In many ways, the boring work of record-keeping, legal oversight, and ceremonial observance became tools of strategy, ensuring that every action reinforced authority and legitimacy. The Ptolemies' approach to religion also shaped Cleopatra's worldview. Her ancestors understood that the pharaoh's power was as spiritual as it was political. Participating in religious rituals, sponsoring temples, and portraying themselves as divine intermediaries were not simply symbolic acts. They were mechanisms to maintain social cohesion and public trust. Cleopatra's later skill in merging Greek and Egyptian religious symbols was rooted in this long tradition, a recognition that legitimacy required cultural sensitivity as much as political competence. Economic management, too, was central to the dynasty's survival. The Nile's cyclical flooding determined agricultural productivity, and Ptolemaic administrators had to carefully plan irrigation, monitor harvests, and collect taxes without provoking rebellion. Grain exports were essential for both domestic stability and foreign diplomacy. Cleopatra's awareness of these systems, learned through observation and instruction, would later allow her to leverage Egypt's resources strategically, both to maintain internal support and to negotiate with foreign powers like Rome. Despite centuries of accumulated experience, the Ptolemaic dynasty was always vulnerable. Revolts, assassinations, and succession disputes were common. External threats from neighboring states and the increasing dominance of Rome created a constant sense of uncertainty. Cleopatra inherited not only the wealth and prestige of her ancestors, but also their challenges. A politically fragile kingdom, a dynasty prone to infighting, and a region of immense international interest. The stability she would later achieve was hard-won, built on a combination of inherited structures, careful observation, and personal acumen. And yet, even with this historical context, one must consider the human dimension. The Ptolemaic rulers were not merely administrators or strategists. They were individuals, navigating personal ambition, familial loyalty, and the expectations of subjects. Cleopatra's predecessors, in their successes and failures, provide a mirror of the challenges she would face. Their experiences offered lessons in diplomacy, resilience, and adaptation. But they also served as warnings. Miscalculation, overconfidence, or failure to understand the dynamics of power could quickly lead to disaster. By examining the immediate ancestry and political environment preceding Cleopatra, you begin to see the intricate web of factors that shaped her world. The legacy of Greek and Egyptian traditions, the importance of ceremonial and administrative precision, the ever-present threat of Roman intervention, and the constant undercurrent of familial rivalry. These elements would all converge during her own reign, influencing her decisions, strategies, and ultimately, her remarkable ability to maintain authority in a precarious world. And yet, a question lingers. How would Cleopatra, with her combination of education, intelligence, and exposure to the successes and failures of her ancestors, navigate a kingdom already defined by centuries of precedent, intrigue, and the looming shadow of Rome? Could one ruler truly control the forces of tradition, ambition, and external power that had challenged every Ptolemaic monarch before her? In the next section, we will examine the final decades before Cleopatra's ascent, focusing on her father's reign, the increasing pressures from Rome, and the political instability that set the stage for her extraordinary entry onto the Egyptian throne. By the mid-1st century BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty was entering its final, turbulent decades before Cleopatra's ascent. While Egypt remained wealthy and culturally significant, the kingdom faced challenges that would test the resilience of any ruler. The reign of Ptolemy XII Auletes, Cleopatra's father, illustrates the fragility and complexity of ruling in a world increasingly dominated by Rome, where internal family disputes and external pressures combined to create a delicate, often dangerous political landscape. Ptolemy XII, also known as Auletes, inherited the throne in 80 BCE after the death of his brother Ptolemy IX. His reign was immediately complicated by questions of legitimacy. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long relied on intermarriage, co-regency, and familial alliances to secure power. But these arrangements also created rivalries and claims that could not easily be reconciled. For Ptolemy XII, the challenge was not only to maintain authority over Egypt, but also to assert his lineage as the rightful ruler in a dynasty where disputes over succession were common. Even at the highest level of government, loyalty was conditional and often swayed by the promise of influence or wealth. Economic and administrative pressures added to these difficulties. Egypt's prosperity depended on careful management of the Nile's flood cycles, taxation of agricultural production, and regulation of trade. Ptolemy XII faced a kingdom in which mismanagement could provoke unrest, and the population, especially in Upper Egypt, was quick to challenge perceived injustice. Rebellion erupted early in his reign, fueled by dissatisfaction with taxation, bureaucratic corruption, and resentment toward a king who was sometimes viewed as disconnected from the realities of Egyptian life. These uprisings provided a stark lesson to Cleopatra, then a child observing her father's strategies, successes, and failures. The young princess would have witnessed firsthand the consequences of both decisive action and miscalculation, lessons that would later inform her careful, deliberate approach to rule. The relationship with Rome became central to Ptolemy XII's survival. By this time, the Roman Republic had extended its influence across the eastern Mediterranean, and Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain, made the kingdom a crucial strategic partner. Ptolemy XII understood that maintaining favor with Rome was essential, even if it required substantial concessions. He paid tribute, cultivated personal connections with influential senators, and spent years in Rome securing political support. In 58 BCE, he was forced into exile, leaving Egypt temporarily under the control of his daughter Berenice IV. This period of instability revealed the delicate balance required to navigate both domestic and foreign politics. Cleopatra's exposure to these events, her father's exile, the temporary displacement of the royal line, and the eventual restoration of Ptolemy XII, provided a blueprint for understanding the fragility of power and the necessity of strategic alliances. The court itself was a hotbed of intrigue. Advisors, generals, and ministers often sought to manipulate rulers for their own gain, using family rivalries and political tensions as leverage. Ptolemy XII's reliance on such figures demonstrated both the utility and danger of trusted intermediaries. Cleopatra, observing these dynamics, would have absorbed important lessons about human behavior, loyalty, and the subtle mechanisms of influence. She saw that authority was never absolute, and that a successful ruler needed not only intelligence, but the ability to navigate a web of competing interests with tact and foresight. Cultural and religious legitimacy also played a critical role. The Ptolemies were foreign rulers in a land with deeply rooted religious traditions, and their authority depended on participation in Egyptian rituals and the maintenance of temples. Ptolemy XII, like his predecessors, carefully balanced Hellenistic and Egyptian customs, performing ceremonial duties to sustain public trust. Cleopatra's education in these traditions, combined with her knowledge of Greek language and culture, positioned her to act as a bridge between two worlds. Her later mastery of symbolism, religious imagery, and ceremonial authority would be rooted in this careful preparation. Roman influence, however, remained a constant pressure. By the time Ptolemy XII returned from exile with Roman support, it was clear that Egypt could not remain isolated from Mediterranean geopolitics. Roman generals and senators could intervene directly in Egyptian affairs, sometimes under the guise of diplomacy, sometimes as a show of force. Cleopatra's early exposure to these interactions, her father's negotiations, the presentation of tribute, and the cultivation of alliances taught her that external power could dictate domestic outcomes. She would later apply this understanding to remarkable effect, navigating relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with the precision of someone who had learned the lessons of her father's reign. Family dynamics continued to shape the court. Rivalries between siblings, ambitions of cousins, and alliances among ministers created an environment in which every action had political weight. Ptolemy XII's efforts to maintain stability included arranging strategic marriages and co-regencies. Yet these measures were never foolproof. Cleopatra, growing into adolescence during these final decades of her father's rule, absorbed the nuances of these relationships, which alliances were reliable, which factions were dangerous, and how subtle shifts in loyalty could determine outcomes. These observations were formative, providing the young princess with the analytical tools and foresight that would define her later political strategies. Even the ordinary, daily work of governance carried strategic significance. Monitoring grain shipments, maintaining temple activities, overseeing legal proceedings, and ensuring public festivals proceeded correctly were not merely administrative chores, they were instruments of authority. Cleopatra would later demonstrate exceptional skill in using these mechanisms to reinforce her legitimacy, blending the ordinary duties of a pharaoh with the strategic exercise of power. By the time Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra had grown into a young woman prepared for leadership. The kingdom she inherited was both a legacy and a challenge. Wealthy, culturally rich, and strategically important, yet politically fragile and exposed to external pressures. The lessons of her father's reign, diplomacy with Rome, vigilance against rebellion, understanding of court intrigue, and mastery of ceremonial authority equipped her with the skills needed to navigate this complex landscape. Her education, observation, and personal acumen positioned her to assert her authority effectively, even in a male-dominated environment fraught with danger. And yet, uncertainty remained. The throne she would inherit was entangled with co-regency, sibling rivalry, and the ever-present influence of Rome. Would she be able to assert herself as ruler in a kingdom defined by centuries of precedent, internal factionalism, and external pressure? Could a single, astute woman maintain authority in a world where male relatives, ambitious ministers, and foreign powers all sought to influence the course of history? The final decades before Cleopatra's reign, marked by her father's challenges, exile, and interactions with Rome, set the stage for her extraordinary rule. They provide the context for understanding the delicate balance she would maintain between domestic authority, cultural legitimacy, and international diplomacy. These years also illuminate the practical lessons. She absorbed lessons in strategy, resilience, and perception that would guide her through one of the most remarkable, though often understated, reigns in history. In the next story, we will explore Alexandria, the city of knowledge and politics, examining the vibrant cosmopolitan environment in which Cleopatra matured, and how the city's culture, trade, and intellectual life influenced the young queen's development and her approach to governance. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand the city in which she was raised. Alexandria, a place of contradictions, ambition, and intellectual brilliance. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, Alexandria quickly became a jewel of the Mediterranean, a hub of commerce, culture, and political influence. By the time Cleopatra walked its streets as a young princess, the city had evolved into a complex, cosmopolitan metropolis, a place where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other cultures coexisted, often uneasily, and where knowledge and politics were inseparable. Alexandria was more than a capital. It was a statement of power. Its strategic location on the Mediterranean coast, with access to the Nile Delta, allowed it to dominate trade routes, link Egypt to the wider Hellenistic world, and act as a bridge between continents. The harbour bustled with ships carrying grain, papyrus, gold, and countless other goods. Traders, diplomats, and travellers from across the known world converged here, bringing news, ideas, and influence. Cleopatra, as a member of the royal family, would have witnessed this constant flow of people and information, absorbing lessons about commerce, diplomacy, and the complex interplay of power and wealth. The city's architecture reflected its ambition. Grand palaces lined the streets, adorned with columns, statues, and inscriptions celebrating both Greek and Egyptian heritage. Temples honored the gods of Egypt, while public spaces echoed Greek civic ideals. The fusion of these cultures was more than aesthetic, it was political. Cleopatra's family ruled as Greeks in Egypt, and the blending of architectural, religious, and cultural symbols reinforced their legitimacy. In her youth, she would have moved among these monuments, learning to understand their significance not merely as buildings, but as instruments of political authority. Perhaps the most famous symbol of Alexandria's intellectual life was the Library of Alexandria, though its exact size and contents remain partly obscured by history. The library and its associated research institutions, the museum or Mausion, were designed to collect knowledge from across the world. Scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and literature, creating a repository of learning unmatched in the ancient world. While Cleopatra may not have spent her days among scrolls in the library, the city itself was infused with an ethos of curiosity, inquiry, and education. She was surrounded by tutors, scribes, and philosophers who encouraged linguistic skill, historical knowledge, and analytical thinking. These formative influences would later manifest in her renowned intelligence and diplomatic acuity. Yet Alexandria was not only a center of learning, it was a city of politics and intrigue. As the capital of a kingdom under pressure from both internal divisions and external powers, Alexandria was filled with rivalries, alliances, and maneuvering. The palace itself was a site of constant negotiation. Ministers, generals, and court officials exerted influence on the monarchs, and factions within the court often sought to manipulate the succession for their own advantage. Cleopatra, growing up within this environment, would have observed the subtle ways in which influence was exercised. She saw that authority depended as much on perception, alliances, and strategic decisions as on formal titles. Trade was another defining feature of the city. Alexandria's markets were filled with goods from across the Mediterranean: olive oil from Greece, spices from the east, papyrus for writing, and grain that fed Rome. The city's wealth created opportunities, but it also exposed vulnerabilities. Dependence on trade meant that political instability, whether in Egypt, neighboring states, or distant Rome. Cleopatra's awareness of these economic dynamics, even in her youth, gave her an understanding of how resources, commerce, and political stability were intertwined. The careful management of the city's wealth and the control of trade routes would later be central to her political strategy. Religion and culture were also omnipresent in Alexandria. Temples, festivals, and public rituals connected the monarchy to the people, reinforcing both spiritual and political authority. Cleopatra grew up participating in and observing these ceremonies, learning how to navigate the symbolic language of power. Greek and Egyptian gods coexisted in public worship, and the monarchy carefully managed the presentation of divine legitimacy. Cleopatra's later skill in combining Greek and Egyptian religious symbolism was grounded in these early experiences, teaching her that power often flowed as much from perception and ritual as from force or decree. The population of Alexandria was diverse, with Greek settlers forming an elite ruling class, Egyptians maintaining local religious and social traditions, and significant Jewish and other communities contributing to trade and scholarship. This multicultural environment was both a strength and a challenge. Cleopatra had to learn, even in her youth, to navigate cultural differences, understand competing expectations, and appreciate the importance of communication across linguistic and social boundaries. These skills, developed in the streets, marketplaces, and courts of Alexandria, would later allow her to manage a kingdom that was simultaneously Greek, Egyptian, and cosmopolitan. Alexandria was also a city of contrasts. Wealth and sophistication coexisted with poverty and social tension. While the palaces were luxurious, many inhabitants lived in crowded quarters, reliant on the Nile for survival. Disease, famine, and unrest were constant threats. Cleopatra's exposure to these realities, even indirectly, would have provided her with a nuanced understanding of governance. Authority was not just about imposing order, but also about sustaining the population, maintaining resources, and responding to the everyday needs of the people. Finally, Alexandria shaped Cleopatra's sense of the wider world. The city's constant influx of travelers and scholars brought news of distant lands, political shifts, and emerging powers. She would have learned early that Egypt was part of a broader Mediterranean network, where events in Rome, Greece, or the Near East could have immediate consequences for the kingdom. This awareness of external pressures, combined with the city's vibrant internal life, created a formative environment in which Cleopatra's intellect, ambition, and strategic thinking could flourish. Yet, even in this cosmopolitan and bustling city, questions lingered for the young princess. How could a ruler maintain authority in a city so full of competing influences? How could she balance the needs of the Greek elite, the Egyptian populace, and foreign powers, without alienating any of them? How much of her later diplomacy and political strategy would be shaped by the lessons learned in these crowded streets, opulent palaces, and busy harbors? As Cleopatra grew, Alexandria was both a stage and a classroom, offering lessons in wealth, politics, culture, and human behavior. The city's influence on her development cannot be overstated. Here, amid the scrolls of the library, the columns of the palaces, and the bustling markets, Cleopatra absorbed the skills, knowledge, and sensibilities that would allow her to navigate the immense challenges of her reign. In the next section, we will explore how Cleopatra, as a young queen, leveraged her understanding of Alexandria's political and social dynamics to assert authority, form alliances, and begin the path that would intertwine her destiny with the greatest powers of the Mediterranean world. As Cleopatra transitioned from adolescence to young adulthood, Alexandria became more than the backdrop of her upbringing. It became the crucible in which her political instincts and strategies were honed. By the time she co-ruled with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, she was acutely aware of the city's intricacies, its wealth and influence, its complex social hierarchies, and its constant undercurrent of intrigue. Understanding Alexandria was crucial for any ruler who wished to maintain control, and Cleopatra's deep familiarity with the city would become one of her most potent tools. The city's political environment was layered and often perilous. Alexandria housed the central organs of the Ptolemaic government, from administrative offices to the royal palace itself. Within these walls, ministers, generals, and advisors exercised influence that sometimes rivaled that of the monarchs themselves. Cleopatra observed these dynamics carefully. She learned which officials could be trusted, which factions were ambitious or dangerous, and how to use both patronage and perception to consolidate her position. The young queen understood early that authority was not simply declared. It had to be earned through strategic alliances, careful negotiation, and the demonstration of competence. One of Cleopatra's first priorities was to assert her legitimacy in a city accustomed to factional maneuvering. She engaged in ceremonial rituals designed to reinforce her position as pharaoh and divine intermediary. Temple appearances, religious processions, and the public performance of duties were not mere pageantry. They were carefully calculated demonstrations of power, intended to remind both the Greek elite and Egyptian populace that Cleopatra's authority was real, sacred, and enforceable. Her education in Egyptian language, religion, and culture allowed her to participate authentically, strengthening her image as a ruler who could bridge both Greek and Egyptian traditions. Alexandria's economy also demanded attention. The city was the hub of Egypt's trade networks, controlling the flow of grain to Rome, goods from Asia, and products from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra understood that economic stability was inseparable from political authority. She oversaw grain distribution, monitored tax collection, and ensured that the city's commerce continued smoothly, even in times of internal tension. Maintaining prosperity was essential. Unrest could erupt quickly if markets failed, harvests fell short, or public confidence wavered. The young queen learned the importance of these mundane details, recognizing that small lapses in administration could undermine even the most powerful ruler. Social dynamics in Alexandria were equally complex. Greek settlers dominated political and administrative life. Egyptian priests maintained religious authority, and various immigrant communities contributed to commerce and scholarship. Cleopatra's ability to navigate these diverse groups allowed her to consolidate influence. She engaged directly with leaders of the Greek elite, fostering loyalty through personal diplomacy and rewards. Simultaneously, she respected Egyptian religious traditions, cultivating support among priests, whose blessing was essential for political legitimacy. The queen's skill in balancing competing interests would become a hallmark of her reign, demonstrating that power was often exercised less through force than through perception, communication, and subtle negotiation. Intrigue, of course, remained ever present. Even in the palace, factions vied for influence over the co-regency. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, including figures such as Pothinus and Achilles, sought to marginalize Cleopatra, fearing her intelligence, independence, and growing popularity. Cleopatra responded not with open confrontation, but with strategic planning. She cultivated her own allies, built networks of loyal officials, and carefully presented her image to the populace. By understanding human behavior and anticipating the ambitions of those around her, she could maneuver effectively, turning potential threats into opportunities for consolidation. The intellectual and cultural environment of Alexandria further shaped Cleopatra's approach to leadership. The city's libraries, schools, and scholars offered a model of governance grounded in knowledge and rational thought. Even if she was not directly engaged in scholarly study daily, the culture of inquiry influenced her understanding of strategy, diplomacy, and problem-solving. Her education in languages, history, and science allowed her to engage with advisors, foreign envoys, and scholars on equal terms, a remarkable advantage in a world where perception often dictated outcomes. Public image was another key arena of influence. Cleopatra's interactions with the citizens of Alexandria were carefully managed to demonstrate benevolence, competence, and accessibility. Religious festivals, charitable acts, and ceremonial appearances were opportunities to reinforce her authority and cultivate loyalty among the population. She understood the subtle power of perception. A queen, seen as both capable and relatable, could command greater loyalty than one who ruled solely through coercion or intimidation. Alexandria was her stage, and she learned to perform the role of monarch with precision and impact. Even the city's hazards provided lessons. Alexandria was prone to civil unrest, fires, and occasional outbreaks of violence. Cleopatra observed how disturbances could escalate if mismanaged, and she learned to act preemptively, addressing grievances, mediating disputes, and ensuring that her administration responded effectively. The young queen's awareness of these risks allowed her to anticipate challenges and make strategic decisions that balanced firmness with diplomacy. In addition, Alexandria's connections to the wider Mediterranean world reinforced the importance of external diplomacy. News of Rome's growing power, the ambitions of neighboring kingdoms, and the shifting alliances of Hellenistic states reminded Cleopatra that her authority was not limited to the city itself. Alexandria's position as a commercial and intellectual hub made it both a prize and a tool. A city that was stable, prosperous, and well managed could serve as a foundation for negotiating power beyond Egypt's borders. Yet, even as she navigated the complex streets, markets, and palaces of Alexandria, questions lingered for the young queen. How could she maintain her authority in a city with so many competing factions? How much influence did the populace, the Greek elite, and the priesthood have over the success of her rule? Could she leverage the city's intellectual and cultural strengths to stabilize her kingdom, or would the pressures of politics and ambition ultimately overwhelm her efforts? Alexandria was, in many ways, a microcosm of Egypt itself, a blend of wealth and danger, knowledge and intrigue, tradition and innovation. Cleopatra's immersion in its rhythms, structures, and personalities provided her with a formative education in governance, diplomacy, and strategy. The city taught her that leadership was as much about perception, intelligence, and human understanding as it was about titles or military power. It was here, in the bustling streets, opulent palaces, and crowded markets of Alexandria, that Cleopatra's abilities as a ruler began to crystallize, preparing her to face the broader challenges of the Egyptian kingdom and the Mediterranean world beyond. As the young queen's presence in Alexandria strengthened, she faced the lingering question: how would she transform her understanding of the city, its economy, politics, and culture into lasting authority over the entire kingdom? How could the lessons of her youth, learned in the corridors of the palace and along the harbor, guide her as she confronted the extraordinary challenges that lay ahead? In the next section, we will explore Cleopatra's decisive early confrontations with Ptolemy XIII and his advisors, the political struggles that marked the beginning of her sole rule, and the strategies she used to consolidate power in Alexandria and beyond. By the time Cleopatra reached her late teens, Alexandria was no longer merely the backdrop of her upbringing. It was the stage on which she would begin to assert her authority in a tangible, consequential way. The city, with its wealth, intellectual life, and political complexity, both nurtured her skills and tested them. Cleopatra's ability to navigate Alexandria's intricate social, political, and economic systems would determine not only her control of the city itself, but also the stability of the entire kingdom she was destined to rule. Cleopatra's early co-regency with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, presented immediate challenges. While custom dictated joint rulership, in practice this arrangement created tensions within the court. Advisors loyal to Ptolemy XIII particularly the influential eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, sought to marginalize Cleopatra, viewing her intelligence, independence, and popularity as threats to their own influence. Their maneuvering underscored a central lesson that Cleopatra had observed since childhood. Power could be as much about controlling perception and alliances as it was about formal authority. Her initial strategy relied on cultivating a base of loyal supporters within Alexandria. Cleopatra recognized that control of the city's bureaucracy, the allegiance of key officials, and the support of influential guilds and merchants were crucial to asserting authority. She carefully balanced Greek and Egyptian interests, ensuring that both communities saw her as a legitimate, capable ruler. In doing so, she created networks of influence that would serve as both defense and leverage in the political struggles that were inevitable in a city like Alexandria. Public perception was central to her approach. Cleopatra understood that the citizens of Alexandria, like her father before her, were accustomed to evaluating rulers not only by their titles, but by their actions and engagement with civic life. She participated in religious rituals, sponsored festivals, and maintained visibility in public ceremonies. These actions were not merely symbolic, they were a deliberate strategy to demonstrate competence, legitimacy, and connection to both the spiritual and civic life of the city. The young queen's mastery of ceremonial authority allowed her to project power and stability, even in the face of internal opposition. Economically, Cleopatra exerted influence over the city's vital systems. Alexandria's markets, harbor trade, and grain supply were not only the lifeblood of the kingdom, but also instruments of political control. By overseeing grain distribution, managing taxation, and engaging with merchants and trade officials, Cleopatra reinforced the perception of her capability and ensured that the city's economic stability supported her authority. In the complex web of Alexandrian politics, even routine administrative oversight became a tool for consolidating power. Intellectual and cultural engagement further distinguished Cleopatra's approach. Alexandria's libraries, scholars, and centers of learning were not just resources for personal education. They were instruments of political legitimacy. By surrounding herself with advisors, scribes, and intellectuals, Cleopatra reinforced her image as a ruler of intellect and sophistication, someone capable of navigating both Egyptian traditions and Hellenistic political expectations. The queen's skill in blending knowledge with strategy demonstrated that power could be exercised subtly, using influence, persuasion, and perception rather than coercion alone. Yet the threat from Ptolemy XIII's faction remained persistent. Advisors and generals sought to control the young king, marginalize Cleopatra, and manipulate succession in their favor. Cleopatra responded with caution, intelligence, and strategic action. She built alliances with influential officials, cultivated loyalty among key segments of the population, and began preparing for the decisive confrontations that would determine the city's and ultimately the kingdom's political landscape. Her approach was methodical. Patience, observation, and the careful orchestration of alliances allowed her to strengthen her position without triggering immediate retaliation. The city itself played a central role in these strategies. Alexandria was not merely a passive backdrop. Its geography, institutions, and communities provided both challenges and opportunities. The royal palace, administrative centers, temples, and marketplaces were arenas in which authority could be demonstrated, alliances forged, and opposition monitored. Cleopatra's intimate understanding of these spaces allowed her to act decisively, turning the city's complexity to her advantage. Religion, too, remained a potent tool of authority. By participating in rituals, supporting temples, and engaging with the priesthood, Cleopatra reinforced her legitimacy in the eyes of the Egyptian population. These actions were deeply strategic. They communicated continuity, respect for tradition, and divine favor, all of which were essential in a kingdom where spiritual authority underpinned political power. Cleopatra's ability to navigate religious and cultural expectations simultaneously with political strategy set her apart from predecessors who had relied solely on force or familial ties. The culmination of these early efforts was the beginning of a broader consolidation of power. Cleopatra's careful management of Alexandria's bureaucracy, her engagement with both Greek and Egyptian communities, and her cultivation of public perception laid the groundwork for her eventual assertion of authority over the kingdom. In these formative months and years, the young queen demonstrated the capacity to act decisively, balance competing interests, and leverage both resources and knowledge for strategic advantage. Alexandria had become not only her home, but her proving ground, a city that tested every aspect of her leadership and prepared her for the extraordinary challenges ahead. Yet, even as Cleopatra strengthened her position, uncertainties remained. The struggle with Ptolemy XIII's faction, the influence of foreign powers, and the city's own volatile social and economic dynamics meant that her authority was never guaranteed. How would she manage these pressures when they escalated beyond subtle maneuvering? Could the lessons learned in Alexandria's palace corridors, temples, and markets suffice to navigate the broader Mediterranean stage, where rival kings and empires watched every move? Alexandria, in all its grandeur and complexity, had shaped Cleopatra into a ruler capable of observing, calculating, and acting with precision. Her early rule in the city demonstrated that even in a kingdom defined by tradition, factional intrigue, and external pressures, authority could be consolidated through intelligence, perception, and strategic engagement. It was here that Cleopatra first proved that she could govern not merely as a figurehead, but as a monarch capable of shaping events to her advantage, setting the stage for the dramatic encounters, alliances, and power struggles that would define her reign. In the next story, we will explore Cleopatra's early diplomacy, navigating Ptolemaic rivalries and Roman ambitions, tracing the critical moments in which the young queen extended her influence beyond Alexandria, beginning her engagement with the wider Mediterranean world, and demonstrating the political acumen that would define her legacy. Cleopatra's ascent to power was not simply a matter of inheritance, it was the result of acute awareness, careful observation, and deliberate action. From the moment she assumed co-regency with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, she was thrust into a world defined by competing factions, fragile alliances, and the ever-present influence of external powers, particularly Rome. The lessons she had absorbed in Alexandria, its politics, trade, and culture, provided a foundation, but the real challenges of diplomacy demanded practical application, negotiation, strategic alliances, and sometimes bold risk-taking. The first tension arose from her immediate family. Ptolemy XIII was nominally her co-ruler, but real authority often rested in the hands of influential court figures, particularly Pothinus, the eunuch tutor and chief advisor, and Achilles, the commander of the army. These men were wary of Cleopatra's intelligence, charisma, and ability to influence the population, fearing that her growing authority threatened their control. They represented the interests of a faction that sought to limit her power and control the kingdom through the young king. Cleopatra, recognizing the danger, adopted a strategy of observation and selective engagement. She cultivated her own allies within the court, including ministers, scribes, and administrators who appreciated her capabilities and were willing to support her initiatives. In doing so, she began to build a power base independent of her brother's faction. Cleopatra's early diplomatic efforts also involved engaging with the broader Egyptian population. Unlike many rulers who relied solely on ceremonial appearances, she understood that her legitimacy depended on perception. She carefully participated in religious rituals, temple ceremonies, and public festivals, demonstrating continuity with tradition while asserting her personal authority. By aligning herself with both Greek and Egyptian cultural expectations, she reinforced her image as a ruler who could bridge two worlds, a quality that would become central to her political identity. At the same time, the international context was growing increasingly urgent. Rome, by the mid-1st century BCE, had emerged as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and Egypt's strategic position and wealth made it a focal point of Roman attention. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had already navigated complex relations with Rome, paying tribute and cultivating alliances to secure his reign. Cleopatra, observing these dynamics, understood that any effective strategy would require engagement with the Republic. She could not govern Egypt in isolation. Her survival depended on her ability to negotiate, influence, and sometimes manipulate Roman interests to her advantage. This realization became starkly apparent when tensions with Ptolemy XIII escalated into open conflict. The king's faction, fearing Cleopatra's consolidation of power, effectively forced her into a position of vulnerability. Yet Cleopatra's response demonstrated her early mastery of diplomacy. She did not rely solely on force, but instead prepared to seek strategic allies, including those beyond Egypt's borders. Her intelligence, multilingualism, and understanding of Roman politics became vital tools, enabling her to plan for the eventual intervention of external powers without appearing weak or indecisive. Cleopatra's approach to these early challenges illustrates the subtleties of her political strategy. She cultivated loyalty among the military, ensuring that key officers recognized her authority and competence. She engaged with Alexandria's bureaucratic structures, maintaining control over economic resources, grain distribution, and administrative functions. She leveraged her knowledge of the city's cultural and religious dynamics to secure support among priests and civic leaders. Each action, no matter how routine, was calculated to reinforce her position and weaken the influence of rivals. Her intelligence and charisma were essential in negotiating alliances. Cleopatra recognized that persuasion and perception could achieve what force alone could not. She communicated a sense of competence and legitimacy, projecting confidence in ways that convinced both domestic and foreign observers that her authority was genuine and durable. In a court dominated by intrigue and factionalism, these skills were crucial. They allowed her to act proactively rather than reactively, turning potential threats into opportunities for consolidation. The early stages of Cleopatra's diplomacy also involved understanding the personalities and ambitions of her rivals. Pothinus, Achilles, and other courtiers were not simply obstacles, they were potential instruments. By discerning their motivations, she could manipulate outcomes subtly, forming temporary alliances, negotiating compromises, and exploiting divisions within opposing factions. Her ability to read human behavior, anticipate actions, and act with precision would become a hallmark of her political career. Moreover, Cleopatra's strategy extended beyond the borders of Alexandria. She was acutely aware that Egypt's stability could not be secured without careful engagement with neighboring powers. The kingdom's grain exports, military positioning, and economic wealth made it a focal point for both regional states and Rome. By preparing for diplomatic engagement with external forces, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt's strategic position became a tool of influence rather than a liability. Her early exposure to Roman politics and the ambitions of Mediterranean powers provided her with a framework for understanding how to leverage external pressure to strengthen her own authority. Yet, even as Cleopatra's skills developed, uncertainties remained. Her co-regency with Ptolemy XIII was fraught with danger, and the ambitions of Roman generals, local officials, and neighboring states created a volatile environment. She faced questions that were both practical and existential. How could she maintain authority in a court dominated by a hostile faction? Could she secure the loyalty of Alexandria's population while preparing for foreign intervention? How could she act decisively without provoking civil war or inviting external conquest? Cleopatra's early diplomatic efforts illustrate the delicate balance required of a ruler in a complex, interconnected world. Success depended not only on intelligence and strategy, but also on timing, perception, and the ability to act decisively in moments of uncertainty. Her observations and experiences in Alexandria, combined with lessons learned from her father's reign, positioned her to navigate these challenges with remarkable skill. And yet, a question remains. How would Cleopatra transition from a ruler constrained by factional opposition to a sovereign capable of commanding both her city and the wider kingdom? How would she convert early alliances and careful observation into decisive action that could withstand both internal intrigue and the overwhelming influence of Rome? In the next section, we will explore the critical turning points in Cleopatra's early rule, including her confrontation with Ptolemy XIII, her first direct engagement with Rome, and the strategies that would define her emergence as Egypt's sole and independent monarch. Cleopatra's early attempts at diplomacy were put to the ultimate test when tensions with her co-regent and younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, escalated into open confrontation. While co-rulership was intended to preserve dynastic stability, in practice it amplified rivalries. Ptolemy XIII's court, led by powerful advisors such as Pothinus and Achilles, feared Cleopatra's growing authority and popularity among both the elite and the populace. These advisors, driven by ambition and a desire to control the monarchy through the young king, effectively isolated Cleopatra, pushing her into a position where decisive action was required. Her first challenge was to secure the loyalty of Alexandria's military and administrative officials. The palace and city were filled with factions, some of whom had grown accustomed to manipulating the throne for personal advantage. Cleopatra recognized that survival depended on identifying allies and understanding potential adversaries. She carefully assessed the motivations of key figures, which officials were primarily loyal to the monarchy itself, which were motivated by personal gain, and which could be swayed to support her vision of authority. This intelligence allowed her to craft strategies that balanced caution with bold action, ensuring that any moves she made would be reinforced by those whose loyalty she could rely on. In this delicate environment, Cleopatra also leveraged her deep understanding of public perception. Alexandria's population, diverse and cosmopolitan, had become accustomed to observing the power dynamics of the royal family. Cleopatra ensured that her presence was visible in religious ceremonies, temple rituals, and public festivals, demonstrating both her competence and her continuity with tradition. This calculated visibility reinforced her image as a legitimate and capable ruler, countering narratives promoted by Ptolemy XIII's faction and cultivating loyalty among the populace. The escalating conflict eventually forced Cleopatra to consider alliances beyond Alexandria. While the city's support was essential, the growing influence of Rome meant that Egypt could not survive in isolation. Cleopatra's awareness of Rome's power, its strategic interest in Egypt's wealth and grain, and the ambitions of key Roman figures shaped her thinking. She recognized that securing Roman support would be decisive in resolving the struggle with her brother and consolidating her authority. At this stage, her diplomacy began to extend outward, preparing for engagements that would place her in direct negotiation with foreign powers, an arena far larger and more consequential than the confines of the palace. The turning point came when Ptolemy XIII's faction, emboldened by their control of key military resources, attempted to force Cleopatra from power. Facing a direct threat, she demonstrated both tactical prudence and strategic foresight. Instead of relying solely on military confrontation, she began building alliances with influential segments of society and potential external supporters. These alliances were based not only on promises of rewards, but also on her demonstrated intelligence, political acumen, and capacity to project authority. Cleopatra understood that loyalty could be cultivated and that perception often mattered more than raw power in determining the outcome of political struggles. During this period, Cleopatra also refined her understanding of human behavior and diplomacy. She observed the ambitions, fears, and motivations of both allies and rivals, using this knowledge to anticipate actions and shape outcomes. Her interactions with court officials, generals, and civic leaders were exercises in subtle influence. She negotiated, persuaded, and sometimes exploited divisions to her advantage. Each decision was calculated, reinforcing her authority while minimizing unnecessary confrontation. Her growing awareness of Rome's role in Egyptian affairs was another critical factor. The city of Alexandria, while wealthy and influential, could not protect her kingdom from external forces alone. Cleopatra recognized that engaging with Rome required careful preparation. She needed to understand Roman politics, identify sympathetic figures with her great party, and present herself as a legitimate and capable sovereign whose authority aligned with Roman interests. This strategic foresight reflected lessons absorbed from her father's reign, when he had navigated the delicate balance between appeasing Rome and maintaining Egyptian sovereignty. Cleopatra's early diplomacy was also shaped by an acute understanding of timing. She knew that rash action could provoke immediate backlash, while hesitation could allow rivals to consolidate power. By choosing the right moments to act, cultivating the right alliances, and projecting the right image, she could influence outcomes without resorting to brute force. Alexandria's complex political environment became both a training ground and a proving ground, where her capacity for strategy, persuasion, and leadership was tested and refined. Yet, despite her growing skill, uncertainty remained. The faction of Ptolemy XIII retained significant control over key military resources, and Rome's engagement, while potentially advantageous, was unpredictable. Cleopatra faced questions that would define her early reign. Could she successfully navigate the internal rivalries of the court while preparing for the intervention of external powers? Would her alliances be sufficient to withstand the ambitions of her brother's faction? How could she act decisively without risking civil war or compromising her legitimacy? Her early confrontations and diplomatic efforts highlight a central theme of Cleopatra's leadership: the integration of observation, strategy, and timing. She combined knowledge of human behavior, awareness of political structures, and understanding of external pressures to create a comprehensive approach to governance. Alexandria was no longer merely a city of learning and culture. It was a dynamic political arena in which she proved her ability to act decisively, balance competing interests, and leverage both internal and external resources. By the end of these early stages, Cleopatra had established a foundation of authority within Alexandria and laid the groundwork for broader engagement with the Mediterranean world. Her skill in navigating the factional dynamics of the court, her strategic use of public perception, and her preparation for diplomacy with Rome demonstrated that she was more than a ceremonial figurehead. She was emerging as a ruler capable of shaping events, managing alliances, and asserting sovereignty in a complex and dangerous environment. And yet, even as she consolidated her position, questions lingered. How would Cleopatra transform these initial alliances and political maneuvers into lasting authority? Could she survive the looming confrontation with her brother? And if so, how would she extend her influence across Egypt and beyond? How would her early diplomacy, learned in the intricate streets and palaces of Alexandria, prepare her for the far more formidable challenges of international politics and the ambitions of Rome? In the next section, we will explore the dramatic turning points in Cleopatra's early rule, including her decisive confrontation with Ptolemy XIII, the famous meeting with Julius Caesar, and the strategies she employed to secure her position as Egypt's sovereign ruler. The struggle between Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII reached a decisive phase in the streets and palaces of Alexandria. The co-regency that was intended to secure dynastic continuity had become a battlefield for influence, loyalty, and legitimacy. Cleopatra, already seasoned by years of observation and political apprenticeship, recognized that the outcome would hinge on a combination of strategy, alliances, and the careful manipulation of perception. The city she knew so intimately, its markets, temples, bureaucracies, and loyal factions, would be both her stage and her instrument. Ptolemy XIII's faction, confident in their control of the army and palace, initially sought to force Cleopatra from power. The queen faced a difficult choice: to confront them directly, risking civil war, or to retreat and seek external support, risking the perception of weakness. Cleopatra chose a calculated middle path. She withdrew strategically to secure her position, while simultaneously cultivating allies both within Egypt and beyond its borders. This retreat was not a surrender but a tactical maneuver, allowing her to gather resources, consolidate loyalty, and prepare for decisive action. Her knowledge of Alexandria's political dynamics proved invaluable. Cleopatra relied on her networks within the administration, ensuring that officials, scribes, and minor generals remained loyal. She leveraged her understanding of human behavior, exploiting rivalries within Ptolemy XIII's faction to weaken their cohesion. Through subtle persuasion and carefully timed gestures of authority, she maintained legitimacy in the eyes of the population and key stakeholders. Even in retreat, she projected competence, stability, and resilience, a combination that reinforced her claim to power. It was during this precarious moment that Cleopatra's foresight brought her into contact with Rome, the Mediterranean's preeminent power. Julius Caesar, having arrived in Alexandria pursuing Pompey during the civil war in Rome, became a pivotal figure in her struggle. Cleopatra recognized the opportunity. Rome could provide both military support and political legitimacy. Yet, engaging with Caesar required subtlety. The queen needed to project strength, intelligence, and charm while ensuring that her objectives remained clear. Her famous encounter, smuggling herself into the royal palace, reportedly wrapped in a carpet or linen sack, was a dramatic act of strategic theatre. It communicated audacity, ingenuity, and decisiveness, qualities that would shape her reputation for centuries. Caesar's arrival shifted the balance of power. Cleopatra's ability to negotiate and present herself as a capable ruler convinced the Roman general to support her claim over her brothers. With Caesar's military presence as leverage, Cleopatra moved to consolidate her authority. Ptolemy XIII's faction, though still formidable, could no longer oppose her without risking direct conflict with Rome. This alliance was not merely a tactical convenience, it demonstrated Cleopatra's understanding of the broader geopolitical landscape. She recognized that domestic success often depended on external relationships, and that diplomacy could achieve what military action alone could not. The subsequent civil conflict culminated in the Battle of the Nile, in which Ptolemy XIII's forces were decisively defeated. The king himself perished during the confrontation, eliminating the primary obstacle to Cleopatra's sole rule. Yet this victory was not simply a matter of force. It was the result of calculated alliances, strategic timing, and the careful orchestration of political and military resources. Cleopatra had demonstrated that her authority was not granted merely by inheritance, but earned through skill, strategy, and the ability to navigate the treacherous currents of power. Following the conflict, Cleopatra solidified her position as Egypt's sovereign ruler. She co-ruled briefly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, maintaining the appearance of dynastic tradition while exercising independent authority. Her partnership with Julius Caesar extended beyond immediate political necessity, shaping Egypt's position within the broader Mediterranean and establishing the framework for future alliances with Rome. The Queen's ability to integrate domestic governance, ceremonial legitimacy, and foreign diplomacy reflected lessons absorbed over decades from her father's reign, her education in Alexandria, and her careful observation of courtly intrigue. Economically, Cleopatra leveraged Alexandria's resources to strengthen her rule. She ensured the stability of grain shipments, maintained trade networks, and administered the city's wealth to reinforce both domestic support and international influence. Alexandria's markets and harbors became instruments of political power, demonstrating that the management of ordinary, boring systems, taxation, distribution, and bureaucracy could be as decisive as any military campaign. Religious and cultural authority remained central. Cleopatra skillfully presented herself as the embodiment of the goddess Isis, combining Hellenistic and Egyptian religious traditions to reinforce legitimacy. These acts of symbolic governance were not mere performance. They were crucial for maintaining cohesion and public confidence in a kingdom that had endured decades of dynastic tension and foreign intervention. Her command of ceremonial power demonstrated that the perception of authority could be as influential as its enforcement. Cleopatra's consolidation of power also demonstrated her understanding of the interplay between personality, image, and diplomacy. Her intelligence, multilingualism, and knowledge of both Egyptian and Greek culture allowed her to communicate effectively with domestic elites, foreign envoys, and Roman leaders alike. She became a ruler whose authority rested not only on military force or inheritance, but on the careful cultivation of influence, perception, and strategic alliances. Yet even in triumph, questions remained for the young queen. How could she sustain this authority in the face of Rome's growing power? How would she navigate future challenges from both domestic factions and external empires. And how would she continue to leverage Alexandria's wealth, culture, and strategic position to secure Egypt's sovereignty in a world dominated by foreign ambitions? Cleopatra's early diplomacy, her confrontation with Ptolemy XIII, and her alliance with Julius Caesar marked the beginning of a reign defined by intelligence, strategy, and resilience. Alexandria, the city of her upbringing, had prepared her for this moment, teaching her the value of observation, the importance of alliances, and the power of perception. The lessons learned within its palaces, temples, and streets became the foundation for her extraordinary ability to navigate the challenges of ruling one of the most influential kingdoms in the ancient world. In the next story, we will explore Cleopatra and Caesar, the political and personal alliance, examining how Cleopatra's relationship with Rome's most powerful general shaped both Egyptian and Mediterranean history, and how their partnership influenced the trajectory of her reign. The encounter between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar was not simply a meeting of two prominent historical figures. It was the convergence of strategy, ambition, and necessity. By 48 BCE, Egypt was a kingdom in turmoil. The recent civil conflict with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, had left Cleopatra on the throne, but her authority was still fragile. Alexandria, though loyal in part to her, was a city accustomed to factionalism and intrigue. Beyond its walls, Rome's expanding influence posed both a threat and an opportunity. In this context, Cleopatra recognized that forming an alliance with Caesar was not merely advantageous, it was essential for the consolidation of her rule. Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing Pompey, the former Roman general who had fled to Egypt after defeat in the Roman Civil War. Pompey's presence in the city introduced a volatile variable. Egypt could not remain neutral in Rome's internal conflicts, yet overt involvement risked destabilizing Cleopatra's recently established reign. Cleopatra's political acumen was immediately apparent in the way she assessed this situation. She saw that aligning with Caesar, rather than opposing him or remaining passive, would provide her with both military backing and political legitimacy. At the same time, she understood the delicate balance required to maintain her sovereignty without appearing as a puppet of Roman power. The famous account of Cleopatra's introduction to Caesar, smuggled into the royal palace, reportedly wrapped in a carpet or bundle, illustrates both her audacity and her strategic genius. This dramatic act served multiple purposes. It conveyed intelligence, initiative, and courage, demonstrating to Caesar that she was a ruler capable of decisive action. It also allowed her to bypass the court's hostile factions, ensuring a direct personal connection with the general. In a world where perception could determine alliances, this bold gesture communicated resourcefulness and command, qualities that would define her leadership throughout her reign. Beyond the theatricality of the encounter, the alliance with Caesar had profound political implications. Caesar, a leader accustomed to both conquest and diplomacy, recognized Cleopatra's intelligence, political skill, and legitimacy as Egypt's sovereign. Supporting her claim to the throne offered him the ability to exert influence in Egypt without directly annexing the kingdom, a subtle extension of Roman power through political alignment rather than overt occupation. For Cleopatra, Caesar's backing provided the military and diplomatic leverage needed to secure her position against Ptolemy XIII's remaining supporters and any domestic factions that might challenge her authority. The strategic dimensions of the alliance extended beyond immediate survival. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth, particularly its grain reserves, made the kingdom a key player in Mediterranean politics. By aligning with Caesar, she ensured that her kingdom remained influential in regional affairs, and that Rome's dependence on Egyptian resources would reinforce her sovereignty. The relationship was, in essence, a sophisticated negotiation of mutual benefit. Caesar gained influence over a crucial ally, and Cleopatra secured her position as a monarch whose authority was strengthened by the most powerful leader in the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra's interactions with Caesar also highlighted her mastery of diplomacy at a personal level. She engaged not only with the political needs of Egypt, but also with the personality, ambitions, and temperament of the Roman general. Recognizing the importance of personal relationships in high-stakes politics, she presented herself as both intelligent and charismatic, someone capable of navigating complex discussions while projecting confidence and authority. In doing so, she transformed a potentially transactional alliance into a dynamic partnership, one that blended personal influence with strategic necessity. Within Alexandria, the alliance had immediate consequences. Ptolemy XIII's remaining faction, which had hoped to retain influence through the young king, was quickly neutralized. Caesar's presence provided both military and psychological support for Cleopatra, deterring further rebellion and reinforcing her legitimacy in the eyes of the populace. Yet Cleopatra did not rely solely on Roman intervention. She continued to consolidate her authority within the city, managing administrative functions, cultivating loyalty among officials, and maintaining the appearance of independent rule. This careful balance between dependence and autonomy became a hallmark of her political style. Economically, the alliance reinforced Cleopatra's control over Egypt's resources. Grain shipments, tax revenues, and trade routes were stabilized through both her governance and the implicit guarantee of Roman protection. Alexandria's markets, docks, and administrative centers became instruments of both domestic control and international diplomacy, demonstrating Cleopatra's understanding that effective leadership depended on the integration of ordinary administrative oversight with high-level political maneuvering. The cultural and symbolic dimensions of the alliance were equally important. Cleopatra's presentation as a legitimate, divinely sanctioned ruler was strengthened through her interactions with Caesar. By engaging with Rome's political elite, she communicated to both Egyptian and foreign audiences that her authority was recognized and respected by the Mediterranean's dominant power. This recognition was not merely ceremonial. It reinforced loyalty among domestic elites, deterred rivals, and positioned Egypt as a sovereign kingdom capable of influencing the broader regional order. Yet, despite the apparent advantages of this alliance, uncertainty remained. Caesar's primary obligations were to Rome, not Egypt, and his support was contingent on his political and military priorities. Cleopatra faced questions that were both practical and existential. Could she maintain her authority if Roman interests shifted? How could she leverage the alliance to strengthen her independent rule without compromising Egypt's sovereignty? And what strategies would she employ to navigate the personal and political dynamics of such a high-stakes partnership? Cleopatra's early engagement with Caesar demonstrates the extraordinary combination of intelligence, audacity, and strategic thinking that characterized her reign. She recognized that survival and success in a politically volatile environment required not only negotiation and alliance building, but also careful attention to perception, timing, and the interplay between domestic and foreign interests. Alexandria, the city of her upbringing, had prepared her for this moment, teaching her the nuances of administration, diplomacy, and the management of complex human networks. And yet, the story of Cleopatra and Caesar had only just begun. While the initial alliance secured her position in Alexandria and neutralized immediate threats, it set the stage for broader political, military, and personal entanglements that would shape both Egypt's future and the history of the Mediterranean world. How would Cleopatra leverage this relationship to extend her influence across the kingdom? Could she navigate the ambitions of Rome's leaders while preserving Egypt's autonomy? And what strategies would define the next phase of her extraordinary reign? In the next section, we will explore Cleopatra's political and personal partnership with Caesar in depth, including the challenges of co-governance, the military campaigns that solidified her rule, and the intricate diplomacy that intertwined Egypt's fate with the Roman Republic.